So we're picking up in our chapter 29 video with the détente with communism. A détente is simply an easing of tensions. And so in the midst of his aggressive actions in Vietnam, Nixon and his foreign policy advisor, a guy named Henry Kissinger, embarked on a pretty epic diplomatic venture. Rather than treating communism as one large enemy, Nixon and Kissinger broke it up, and they dealt with Russia and China as two separate communist powers. So in February of 1972, Nixon became the very first president to visit the People's Republic of China. And he followed this unprecedented move by meeting with the Soviet leadership in Moscow in May, just a few months later. And so when Nixon returned from Moscow, he had signed a treaty calling for the limitation of strategic arms. And this is SALT, basically an agreement to limit nuclear weapons. And this new policy, also called détente, just again means a relaxing of tensions. And it actually allowed the U.S. to play off the two communist superpowers against each other. By October of 1972, Kissinger had negotiated a draft settlement with the North Vietnamese, and shortly before the next election, Nixon announced that peace was at hand. So Nixon was able to win a landslide victory in the election of 1972 over Democratic nominee George McGovern. McGovern didn't really run a smooth campaign. There was factionalism within his party. His oratorical style was just bumbling. He was just an awkward speaker. And he put out these proposals that were very poorly thought out. So people didn't really trust him as a presidential candidate. So Nixon won a very large victory. He won in the South, and he won among northern blue-collar workers. And, you know, with his anti-inflationary policies, détente, you've got the prospects of peace in Vietnam. Nixon looks like a successful and powerful president. However, the agreement that Kissinger had negotiated with the North Vietnamese fell apart when Nguyen Van Thieu, I'll just put the last name, South Vietnam's president, refused to sign it. So after attempting to get more favorable terms from the North Vietnamese by ordering extensive bombing of the North, Nixon finally reached a settlement with the North Vietnamese in January of 1973. At this point, the U.S. had lost more than 57,000 lives in Vietnam and had spent more than $150 billion in Vietnam. So the war finally came to an end. So domestic policy under Nixon, taking a look at what was going on in the United States. So the most serious issue that Nixon faced at home was the high rate of inflation that was caused mostly by large military outlays of the Johnson administration and his refusal to raise taxes. So one of the first things Nixon did with his second term was to balance the federal budget. And the Federal Reserve Board also raised interest rates. Prices did continue to rise, however, and in 1970, Congress passed legislation giving the president the power to regulate wages and prices. Nixon wasn't really in favor of this legislation because it gave the government a larger role, but he did implement it the following year to try to prevent or slow inflation. So phase 2 of his anti-inflationary policies involved the creation of a pay board and a price commission to limit wage and prices or price increases after the freeze ended. It did cause inflation to slow down, but it did not stop. Even though Nixon was a conservative, he was elected by a lot of conservatives, he did not pursue a rigid conservative course. For one, he proposed a very bold plan for a minimum income for poor families, and this actually alarmed the conservatives who had elected him, and it failed to pass Congress. And then in 1970, he signed the Clean Air Act, and this legislation created the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency. Nixon did not alienate the Southern conservatives altogether. His Southern strategy still sought the support of the conservative vote in the South by pulling back on the federal government's commitment to school desegregation, and for the most part by appointing conservative justices to the Supreme Court. But after his triumphant re-election and the withdrawal of troops from Vietnam, he did attempt to change the direction in which the nation had been moving for decades. Over the last several years, Congress had been strengthening the power of the president, and the government seemed to be getting larger and larger. Nixon did, though, seek to decentralize his administration, and he did that by returning many of the functions of government to the state and local government, so empowering the state and local governments to deal with issues and write laws, so that he could decentralize the federal government. He also set out to reduce the role of government in people's lives. We talked about the fact that with FDR and the New Deal, people came to depend on the government, and they saw the government as responsible for the well-being of the people. So Nixon sought to reduce that, and these aims did bring him into conflict with liberals, and in an effort to combat inflation, he ended up setting a limit on federal spending, and there were liberals who did not like that, and he even had to reinforce that limit by impounding the funds that Congress had appropriated. Basically, he refused to spend those funds. So Nixon did experience criticism when he tried to reduce the role of government and to limit how much was being spent by Congress. So Nixon was probably most famous for his Watergate scandal. So basically what happened was some members of the Committee to Re-elect the President, or CREEP, broke in to the Democratic headquarters in the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C., and wiretapped the place. And someone wrote a letter to Judge John Sirica revealing that high-level Republican officials were aware of the break-in. And so Nixon when questioned about whether or not he knew anything about the break-in, he denied the involvement of anyone in the White House. So soon after that, the head of CREEP, a guy named Jeb Stuart Magruder, and John Dean III, legal counsel to the president, admitted that they were involved. And so after these revelations, Nixon dismissed Dean, and actually most of the president's closest advisors, including H.R. Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, and Richard Kleindienst, resigned as a result of this scandal coming to light. Dean, since he was dismissed, then charged that the president had participated in the attempt to cover up the scandal. So then there were grand jury investigations, and the findings of the Senate investigation, headed by Sam Ervin, revealed that the president had acted to obstruct investigations into the matter. These investigations also revealed that the president and his staff had abused powers of their offices and orchestrated an array of illegal and unethical practices during the election campaign. So this went back further than just Watergate. So the Senate Watergate Committee learned of the existence of these tapes that Nixon had made of White House conversations. Well, Nixon refused to surrender these tapes to the committee, and so people at this point began to say that he needed to resign or maybe even be impeached. And in response to that, Nixon appointed a special prosecutor to investigate the affair, and this guy's name was Archibald Cox. And Archibald Cox soon made the president really angry by seeking access to some records, including the tapes that Nixon had refused to turn over. Nixon then ordered that Cox should be fired. Well, this was left to Attorney General Elliot Richardson and his deputy to fire Cox. Well, rather than firing him, they just resigned. And so Robert Bork, who was the Solicitor General, actually carried out Nixon's order to fire this guy. And this outraged the public. And it was at this point that the House Judiciary Committee considered impeachment. Nixon finally backed down a little bit. He named a new prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, and finally turned the tapes over to Judge Sirica. However, when they started going through the tapes, they realized that some of them were missing, and an important section of another one of the tapes had been completely erased. So at this point, the vice president, Spiro Agnew, who was a champion of law and order, resigned, and he pleaded nolo contendere to charges of accepting bribes and committing tax fraud while serving in public office in Maryland. The plea that he made, the nolo contendere, just means, it's Latin for I do not wish to contend. So basically, I'm not going to put up the fight, I'll just resign. So at that point, Nixon nominated and Congress confirmed Gerald Ford, who had been a congressman from Michigan, as vice president. So, the judgment on Watergate. So in March of 1974, a federal grand jury indicted Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Mitchell, and 4 other White House aides on charges of conspiracy to obstruct justice in the Watergate investigations. Nixon was named as an unindicted co-conspirator. And so Nixon finally released edited transcripts of the White House tapes to the press. Not only were the tapes incriminating, they also exposed a distasteful side of Nixon's character, as he used lots of filthy language in those. And then in the summer of that same year, 1974, the House Judiciary Committee, in televised proceedings, voted to adopt 3 articles of impeachment against Nixon. And so he was charged with obstructing justice, abusing the powers of his office, and failing to comply with the committee's subpoenas. And on the eve of the debates, the Supreme Court ruled that he had to turn over 64 additional tapes to the special prosecutor. And the tapes proved conclusively that Nixon had been in on the cover-up from its earliest stages. And at that point, virtually all of his support in Congress completely evaporated. Since Richard Nixon was facing impeachment and conviction, on August 9th, 1974, he became the first president to resign. And his newly appointed vice president, Gerald Ford, became president. Shortly after taking office, Ford pardoned Nixon for any crimes he had committed while in office. So just to kind of conclude Nixon's presidency, the policy of détente was important because it marked an easing of Cold War tensions. The war at this point was not over, but it did relax some. However, the failure of some of his domestic policies, his interventionist policies, signaled the growing disillusionment with the campaign that Lyndon Johnson had started, the Great Society. So this concludes chapter 29, and we'll pick up in the next chapter with society in flux, looking at what society was like in the 50s, 60s, and 70s.